The glass tower of the city gleamed like silver under the sun, and inside its tallest floor, a boardroom stretched wide with windows that opened into the sky. The city buzzed far below. Cars looked like toys, and buildings lined the horizon. Inside the room, powerful men in expensive suits sat around a long wooden table. They laughed loudly, spoke in confident voices, and carried themselves like they owned the world. That morning, a girl named Amara stood at the door. She was only a teenager, dressed in a clean red polo shirt and carrying a backpack that looked far too ordinary for such a place. She had walked all the way to this building, clutching her dream and her courage. Her heart pounded as the assistant opened the door and let her in. The eyes of the men turned to her, some curious, some amused. She was out of place, a young girl in a room full of millionaires. The man at the head of the table was Richard Hamilton, one of the city's most powerful businessmen. His suits were custom-made, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and his words carried weight that could build or break companies overnight. He raised an eyebrow when he saw Amara. "Who is this?" he asked with a chuckle. Did someone bring their child to work? The room erupted in laughter. Amara felt the heat rise in her face, but she took a step forward. She had promised herself she would not shake, not falter. She had walked in with a purpose, and she would not let their laughter steal her strength. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but her words cut through the noise. "I'm Amara," she said, "and I speak 9 languages." The room went silent for a moment. Then, just as quickly, the laughter grew louder. The men slapped the table, shaking their heads in disbelief. One of them leaned back and said, "9 languages? That's impossible. She must be joking." Richard smirked. 9 languages? That's more than most of us can manage with one. You've got confidence, I'll give you that. But little girl, this is not a talent show. This is business. But Amara did not flinch. She walked to the empty chair across from them and sat down, her backpack resting on the floor by her feet. She looked Richard in the eye and repeated softly, 9 languages, and I can prove it. For a moment, Richard studied her, unsure whether to send her out or let her continue. Something in her steady gaze caught him off guard. He had seen many people beg for chances, many people crumble under pressure, but this girl's eyes carried a fire. Against his better judgment, he leaned forward and waved his hand. "Go on then, show us." Amara took a deep breath. Then she began to speak. Her first words were in French, elegant and smooth, a flawless greeting that rolled off her tongue, as though she had grown up in Paris. Without pausing, she shifted into Spanish, her words bright and rhythmic, carrying the warmth of a new world. The executives blinked, their smiles fading slightly. Then came Mandarin, tones precise and clear. One man at the table, who had traveled often to China, nearly dropped his pen. She didn't stumble once. Amara moved on, her voice steady, now speaking in Arabic with confidence and grace. By the time she switched to Russian, her rhythm powerful and exact, the room had fallen silent. She did not stop there. Hindi followed, then Swahili, then German, then Japanese. Each language she spoke sounded natural, not memorized, not mechanical. She carried them with ease, her accent sharp, her sentences flowing. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands on the table. 9, she said simply. For a long moment, no one spoke. The laughter had disappeared. The executives exchanged glances, disbelief painted on their faces. One of them whispered, "She wasn't lying." Richard Hamilton cleared his throat. He stared at Amara with new eyes, but pride kept him from showing too much respect. "Impressive," he said slowly. "But tell me why. Why would a girl like you need 9 languages? What's the point?" Amara's gaze did not waver. She leaned forward, her voice steady but filled with passion. "Because languages are doors. Each one I learned opened a new world. Each one gave me friends, teachers, stories, and chances I would never have had. People think knowledge is locked away for the rich. I wanted to prove them wrong. I wanted to show that even a girl like me with no money can speak to the world." The words hit the room harder than she expected. These men had built empires, but here was a girl with nothing but discipline and fire in her heart, daring to sit at their table. Richard studied her again. His smirk had softened, though his pride still held him back. "You're bold," he admitted. "But boldness is not enough in this world. You think 9 languages can buy you a place at this table?" Amara straightened her back. "No," she said calmly, "but they can give me the strength to build my own table." The words fell like a stone in the stillness. For the first time, the men who had laughed were silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had no answer. Richard tapped his pen on the table, his mind turning. The girl was not ordinary. She had something none of them could buy, something they couldn't put on a resume or price in the stock market. Still, he leaned back in his chair, hiding his thoughts behind a mask of amusement. "Well, Amara," he said, "you've made quite an entrance. But let me warn you, the world is not kind to dreamers. You've shown us a trick. Now the question is, do you have the strength to prove it matters?" Amara met his gaze with calm determination. "I didn't come here to do tricks," she said. "I came here to show you what you've overlooked. You laugh at people like me, but one day you'll see that we are the ones who will change everything." The room fell quiet again. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, towers of glass and steel rising against the sky. Inside, a girl with nothing but her courage and her words had shaken the pride of men who believed they were untouchable. And though Richard tried to hide it, deep inside he felt something stir, something he had not felt in a long time. Respect. Amara had walked into the lion's den, and instead of being devoured, she had made the lions pause. This was only the beginning. The boardroom still echoed with the silence Amara had left hanging in the air. Her words lingered, not like a child's boast, but like a truth they had all failed to see. The men who once laughed now shifted uncomfortably. In their seats, their pride bruised, but their curiosity awakened. For many of them, it was the first time in years someone had walked into this room and spoken without fear. And here she was, a girl with a backpack, refusing to bow, refusing to shrink. Richard Hamilton, the man at the head of the table, leaned back in his chair and studied her with sharp eyes. For years, he had seen hundreds of graduates, polished, professionals, and even ambitious entrepreneurs come and go. They all carried the same rehearsed speeches, the same desperate hunger to please him, the same polite fear in their voices. Yet here sat Amara, steady and unshaken, as if she belonged there more than any of them. He almost admired her courage, but he was not ready to let her win. "So you can talk," he said finally, his voice dripping with skepticism. "But words are cheap. The world doesn't reward talent unless it's useful. Tell me, little girl, what exactly do you expect us to do with your 9 languages? Should I clap and send you home?" The executives chuckled nervously, but the laughter lacked its earlier confidence. Amara didn't flinch. Her eyes met Richard's without fear. "I don't want your applause," she replied. "I want you to understand. You sit here in your tower and laugh at people like me, but outside these walls, the world is changing. Business is not about money alone. It's about connection. It's about understanding people, cultures, and voices. And that's something none of your millions can buy." Her words were direct, simple but sharp. The men at the table froze again. For a moment, no one dared to interrupt. They weren't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone so young. Richard smirked to cover the sting. He tapped his fingers on the polished wood of the table. "Connection, you say? All right then, let's put your connection to the test. If you're as good as you claim, prove it here and now." He snapped his fingers, and one of his assistants rushed to bring a stack of documents, contracts, business proposals, and reports from their global operations, printed in multiple languages. Some were in Spanish, others in French, a few in German and Mandarin. The assistant placed them in front of Amara with a thud. "Translate these," Richard said with a challenge in his eyes. "Show us you're more than just a good memory for greetings." Amara looked at the pile, then back at Richard. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to fail. But failure was not something she feared anymore. She reached for the first page, scanned it quickly, and began to read aloud, translating each sentence into English with precision. Her voice was steady, her rhythm natural, as if she had been doing this for years. The executives leaned forward, astonished. She moved to the next page, this one in French, and once again she didn't stumble. She not only translated but also explained the tone of the writing, the cultural nuances hidden in the phrases. When she reached the German text, one of the men at the table, who had studied the language himself, sat up straighter, nodding slowly in disbelief. She was flawless. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour, as Amara continued. The more she spoke, the quieter the room became. What began as a challenge turned into a lesson. She was not showing off. She was teaching them something they had forgotten, that knowledge was power, and power could be born in the humblest of places. Finally, Amara set the last document down. She looked at Richard calmly, not with arrogance but with quiet strength. "You asked me to prove it," she said. "I have. But this isn't just about me. It's about what people can achieve when they're not laughed at, when they're given a chance. There are millions of children like me, brilliant, determined, but ignored because they don't wear suits or carry titles. You sit here thinking talent only exists in your world, but it's out there too, waiting to be seen." Her voice grew, softer, almost trembling with emotion, but it carried weight that no degree or diploma could match. "Do you know how I learned these languages? Not with private tutors, not with fancy schools. I borrowed old library books. I stayed up late watching videos with broken subtitles. I practiced with shopkeepers, cab drivers, and neighbors who spoke different tongues. I listened, I repeated, I failed, and I tried again. I had no money, no guidance, but I had determination. That's why I'm here, because I believe determination can open doors even money cannot." The room was still. The executives glanced at one another, uncomfortable but deeply moved. They had spent their lives in luxury, solving problems with checks and contracts, but here was a girl showing them that resilience and hunger could outshine privilege. Richard cleared his throat, trying to keep his composure. "So you've worked hard. Fine. But what makes you think that matters in the real world? Life is cruel, Amara. People like you get left behind. That's the truth." Amara leaned forward. Her voice was calm, but carried steel. "No, Mr. Hamilton. People like me are the future. You think I'm alone, but there are countless others out there, children who are fighting to learn, who dream even when the world tells them not to. You can laugh at us, ignore us, but you cannot stop us. Because the moment we find our voices, the world will have to listen." Her words struck harder than she expected. Richard sat back, his smirk gone. For the first time, he saw not just a girl, but a storm. One of the younger executives cleared his throat and said quietly, "She's right. We spend millions on consultants to bridge language gaps. Imagine if we had someone like her on our team." The others murmured in agreement, though Richard remained silent. Pride burned in him, unwilling to admit defeat. But deep inside, even he knew he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Amara rose from her seat, her backpack slung over her shoulder. She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes. "You laughed at me when I walked in, but one day you'll remember this moment. Not because I speak 9 languages, but because I refuse to let your laughter break me. I'm not here to beg for a place at your table. I'm here to remind you that the future doesn't wait for permission." With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Each step echoed loudly against the silence of the room. No one stopped her. No one dared to laugh again. They just watched as a girl with nothing but courage and knowledge walked out, leaving behind a room full of men who suddenly felt smaller than they ever had before. When the door closed, Richard sat in silence, staring at the skyline beyond the glass windows. For the first time in years, he felt unsettled. The laughter he had once enjoyed now rang hollow in his memory. That girl had not only spoken 9 languages, she had spoken a truth that money could never silence. He didn't know it yet, but that meeting would haunt him. The face of a determined young girl would return to his mind in moments of doubt, reminding him that true power was not in wealth or arrogance, but in resilience. in the ability to rise no matter how many times the world tried to push you down. And, though he would never admit it to his colleagues, Richard Hamilton had been left in shock. When Amara left the boardroom that day, her footsteps echoed in the hallway, but inside her chest her heart beat like a drum. She had faced men who ruled towers of glass and steel, and though they laughed at her, she had not crumbled. The silence she left behind was proof enough that her voice carried power. Still, as the elevator doors closed, her mind drifted back, not to the room she had just left, but to the long road that had brought her here. Because what they saw was a girl speaking 9 languages, but what they didn't see was the struggle, the nights of hunger, the hours of loneliness, the weight of a dream carried on shoulders that were too young yet too strong to bend. Amara grew up in a small neighborhood where the streets were cracked and opportunities were rare. Most families worked long hours to put food on the table, and dreams were often silenced before they could grow. Her mother worked 2 jobs, her father gone, before she could remember his face. From the time she was little, Amara carried the quiet, knowledge that life was not fair, but she also carried something brighter, an unshakable belief that she could make it different. She remembered the first time she saw tourists in her city, speaking in languages she didn't understand. She was only 8, standing outside a corner store, listening to their laughter. She had felt a fire then, a whisper, that said, "Learn their words, and nothing will stop you." At first, people laughed. Her classmates teased her when she carried old library books with titles they couldn't read. They told her she was wasting time, that no one cared how many ways she could say hello. But Amara kept going. She found a small notebook, filled it, with words she didn't yet understand, and repeated them every night. Some nights she studied by candlelight when the electricity failed, whispering words into the dark as if the walls themselves were listening. It wasn't easy. Sometimes hunger gnawed at her stomach while she tried to memorize sentences. Sometimes exhaustion weighed heavy after helping her mother clean houses. But she still opened her books. She didn't have tutors or online classes that cost money. Instead, she found strangers willing to speak to her for a few minutes. Taxi drivers who smiled when she greeted them in their own language. Storekeepers who corrected her when she stumbled. Piece by piece, she built her world. There were failures, many of them. She remembered trying to speak Spanish the first time, only to mix up her words and earn laughter from the group she approached. The sting of embarrassment burned, but she went home, practiced harder, and came back the next week to try again. She failed in French verbs, mixed Mandarin tones, confused German cases, but each mistake was a stone she used to build the foundation of her strength. Her mother sometimes looked at her with worry. "Why do you push yourself so hard, Amara?" she asked one night, watching her daughter's lips move silently as she practiced. Amara smiled faintly and replied, "Because one day, Mama, I will speak to the world, and the world will have to listen." That promise carried her through the hardest days. She traded toys for second-hand dictionaries, skipped outings with friends so she could study grammar, and practiced speaking to her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. For years, her world was small, but in her mind she traveled continents, meeting people through their words, learning their stories even without leaving her block. Then came the turning point. At 14, she entered a local competition where students had to introduce themselves in another language. Most of the others managed 2 or 3 greetings. When it was her turn, Amara stepped on stage, her voice trembling at first, then steadying as she spoke one introduction after another. Spanish, French, German, Swahili, Mandarin. She kept going until the audience sat in stunned silence. When she finished, there was no laughter, only thunderous applause. For the first time, she felt the world open a crack, as if all her years of effort were finally seen. That moment planted a seed in her. She began dreaming bigger, not only of mastering languages, but of proving to those who doubted her that knowledge could rise above wealth. She wanted to show that a poor girl with nothing but determination could stand in rooms built for millionaires and make them listen. And so she pushed harder. By 16, she had already reached fluency in 9 languages. She spent mornings helping her mother, afternoons at school, and nights studying. When others slept, she whispered words into the dark. She carried flashcards in her pocket, practiced during bus rides, and wrote translations on scraps of paper she collected. Each day was a battle, but she won them one by one. Still, the world was not kind. Teachers often dismissed her, saying, "What's the use of all this? You should focus on something practical." Friends drifted away, thinking she was strange, and yet Amara did not stop. Deep inside, she knew her dream wasn't only for herself, it was for every child who had ever been told they weren't enough. By the time she found herself in that boardroom, she carried not just languages but years of struggle, years of resilience. Each word she spoke that day was born of sacrifice, each sentence a memory of a night spent fighting exhaustion and doubt. The men in suits couldn't see that, but they felt it. They felt the weight of her grit, the power of someone who had nothing but refused to be nothing. As she walked out of the building, she remembered the faces of those who once mocked her. She thought of her classmates who had laughed at her notebooks, the neighbors who had shaken their heads at her strange obsession, and she smiled, not out of arrogance but out of quiet victory. She had carried her struggle like armor, and it had brought her here. But Amara also knew this was only the beginning. The world was still full of people who doubted her, who believed money was the only power worth having. She was determined to prove them wrong, not by shouting, not by forcing, but by continuing, to rise by carrying her grit into every room, every conversation, every challenge. The men in the boardroom thought they had seen a girl with a gift, but what they truly witnessed was a girl with a story of struggle, a story that could not be bought, broken, or silenced. They would remember her not because she spoke 9 languages, but because she showed them what grit looked like. And as she disappeared into the busy streets below the tower, Amara whispered to herself the words that had carried her through all those years. One day, the world will listen. The city outside the tower buzzed with its usual rhythm, cars honking, voices blending, skyscrapers shimmering under the sun. But inside Richard Hamilton's boardroom, something had shifted. The men who once laughed at Amara were now silent, their thoughts scattered, their pride unsettled. Richard himself, a man who had built his empire on ruthlessness and sharp instincts, found himself replaying her words in his mind. He hated admitting it, but something about that girl unsettled him. She was not polished, she was not wealthy, but she carried a power no one in that room could deny. The next day, Richard did something unusual. Instead of brushing off the encounter, he called Amara back. His assistant was surprised. "Sir, she's just a kid. Do you really want her in another meeting?" Richard didn't explain, he only said, "Bring her in." When Amara arrived, her backpack still slung over her shoulders, the atmosphere was different. This time, there was no laughter when she entered. The executives eyed her carefully, still unsure of what to make of her. Richard gestured toward a seat. "Sit," he said simply. She did, her expression calm, though inside she wondered what new test he had planned. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Yesterday, you impressed us with your words, but business isn't about words alone. It's about decisions. Negotiations, risk. You claim your knowledge gives you strength. Prove it." He snapped his fingers again, and the assistant placed another stack of documents on the table. But this time, they weren't just language exercises. They were contracts, real ones. Deals involving millions written in multiple languages filled with complex clauses. Even his top lawyers often struggled with them. Richard smirked, expecting hesitation. "Find me the problems," he challenged. "Tell me what others can't see. If you're as extraordinary as you claim, this should be simple." The room watched closely. Amara took a deep breath, opened the first contract, and began to read. The words leapt out at her, not because they were simple, but because she had trained herself to see patterns others ignored. Hours of studying under flickering light had sharpened her mind in ways these men couldn't imagine. She read, translated, and pointed out a clause that shifted risk unfairly onto Richard's company. The executives frowned. They hadn't even noticed it. She moved on to another document. In French, she highlighted a hidden fee disguised as cultural phrasing. In German, she spotted a line that allowed a partner company to exit without penalty, something that could cost millions. With each discovery, the room grew more astonished. The smirks faded completely. Even Richard leaned forward now, listening intently. Amara was not showing off. She was solving problems. Problems their wealth and power had blinded them to. She wasn't just a girl who spoke 9 languages. She was someone who could save them from losses, someone who could see what even experts missed. By the time she closed the final document, silence hung heavy in the room. Amara looked up, her face calm. "You asked me to prove myself. I have. Not because I'm smarter than anyone else, but because I never stopped learning. You measure power in money. I measure it in knowledge. And knowledge, Mr. Hamilton, is what keeps empires from crumbling." The words cut deep. For a long moment, Richard didn't move. His pride fought to resist the truth. But even he could not deny what he had just witnessed. Slowly, he leaned back, his eyes never leaving hers. "You've shown me something," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. "Something I didn't expect to see from someone like you." He paused, then added sharply, "But don't mistake this for victory. The world will not hand you success because of your talent. It will fight you, mock you, and try to crush you. What will you do then?" Amara held his gaze. Her voice was steady. "The same thing I've always done. I'll rise. Every time they push me down, I'll rise again. That's the difference between me and those who laugh at me. I don't stop." The room went still again. One of the younger executives, unable to hold back, clapped once. Others joined, slowly at first, then louder, until the boardroom was filled with applause. For the first time, Richard didn't stop them. But even as the applause faded, Richard felt a strange pull inside. For years he had built walls around himself, convinced that money and power were the only truths. Yet here was a girl with nothing but determination, shaking the very foundation of his beliefs. He realized with a shock that he respected her. After the meeting, Richard caught Amara as she left. "Why do you do this?" he asked quietly. "Why push yourself so hard?" Amara looked at him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite name. "Because there are children like me everywhere. Children who are told they'll never be enough, who are laughed at, ignored, dismissed. I don't do this just for me. I do it for them. To show them it's possible." For the first time in years, Richard felt something stir in him that wasn't ambition or greed. It was something softer, something he thought he had lost long ago. Hope. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, hearing Amara's words again and again. "I'll rise. Every time they push me down, I'll rise again." It haunted him, not because it was naive, but because it was true. He had spent his life crushing others to climb higher, yet here was a girl proving that real power wasn't in crushing but in enduring. In the days that followed, Richard watched her quietly. He invited her back, not to test her but to listen. Each time she spoke, she challenged him, reminded him of the things he had forgotten: resilience, humility, humanity. He realized he was not just mentoring her. In some strange way, she was teaching him. The challenge that day in the boardroom was meant to break her. Instead, it broke something in him, his arrogance, his certainty that wealth was the only measure of worth. And though he would never admit it to his colleagues, Richard Hamilton knew that he, the millionaire who laughed, had been left in shock by a girl who refused to bend. From that day forward, the world began to change. Not just for Amara, but for Richard too. And though their paths were different, they were now tied together by one undeniable truth. The strength of the human spirit cannot be mocked, cannot be bought, and cannot be silenced. The story of that day in the boardroom did not end when Amara closed the contracts or when the executives applauded. In truth, that moment was only the beginning of something far greater, something she herself didn't yet realize. For a while, the men in that room carried on with their business. They carried a new memory inside them, the memory of a girl who had walked in with nothing and left behind an impression stronger than any deal they had signed. Richard Hamilton, in particular, could not shake her presence. He had lived his entire life chasing numbers, profit margins, market shares, acquisitions. Success to him had always been measured in wealth and power. Yet when he closed his eyes at night, it wasn't the sound of stock reports or the figures on his computer that filled his thoughts. It was Amara's steady voice, her calm eyes, her words that cut sharper than any contract. "I don't want your applause. I want you to understand." For days, Richard replayed that line. He thought of the way she had spoken of children like her, children who had no chance, no privilege, yet still carried dreams as heavy as mountains. He had dismissed such people for years, considering them irrelevant to his world of power. But now, he realized that maybe the true strength of society lay not in the towers he built, but in the determination of those at the bottom, clawing their way upward with nothing but grit. Amara, meanwhile, continued her journey with the same quiet determination. She did not wait for recognition, nor did she dwell on the shock she had left behind in the tower. She went back to her neighborhood, back to the streets where children still played with broken toys and families still struggled to make ends meet. Yet she walked taller now, carrying within her the proof that she could stand in any room. No matter how powerful, and not be silenced. Her story began to spread in whispers. First through the assistants who had watched her translate documents with flawless ease, then through executives who spoke of the strange day when a teenager had humbled them all. Soon even people outside the boardroom began to hear of her, a girl who spoke 9 languages and had silenced millionaires with nothing but her voice. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, but those who had seen it with their own eyes knew it was real. Richard found himself at a crossroads. He could ignore her, bury the memory, and return to his old ways, or he could acknowledge that she had changed him. One evening, staring at the city from his penthouse, he finally admitted it aloud. "She's right." The word surprised even him. He had spent years laughing at idealists, yet now he found himself wanting to help one. The next morning, he made a decision that shocked his staff. He arranged for Amara to meet him again, but this time not in a boardroom full of executives. Instead, he asked her to walk with him through the city streets. At first she was cautious, unsure of his intentions. But as they moved past shops, schools, and crowded sidewalks, Richard spoke differently. He asked about her life, her struggles, her dreams. For the first time, he listened not as a businessman, but as a human being. Amara told him everything. About studying by candlelight, about carrying notebooks filled with scribbles, about failing again and again, but never stopping. She spoke of her desire to open schools where children from poor backgrounds could learn languages for free, where knowledge would not be locked behind wealth. Richard listened silently, his face unreadable. But inside, something shifted again. When she finished, he stopped walking and looked at her seriously. "You've taught me more in 2 days than most of my advisors have taught me in years," he said. "I laughed at you, but now I see you carry something money can't buy. If you want to build those schools, I'll help you." Amara was stunned. For a moment, she searched his eyes, wondering if this was another test, another joke. But he wasn't smiling. For the first time, Richard Hamilton spoke without arrogance. And so, a partnership began, an unlikely alliance between a millionaire and a girl from the streets. Richard provided resources, but Amara provided vision. She refused to let him take control, reminding him often, "This is not about charity. This is about change." Together, they opened small centers where children could come after school, to learn languages, to dream bigger than their neighborhoods, to see themselves not as victims of circumstance but as citizens of the world. The first center was modest, built in a renovated community hall. On the opening day, Richard expected only a handful of children. Instead, dozens poured in, their eyes wide, their hands eager to touch books and screens they had never had access to. Amara stood before them, her voice steady as she greeted them, in different languages, just as she had done in the boardroom. The children gasped, laughed, and clapped. For them, it was magic. For Amara, it was the beginning of her legacy. Over time, the centers grew. More children came, more volunteers joined, and more lives changed. Amara's dream was no longer just her own, it became a movement. And everywhere it went, people remembered how it began. with a girl who walked into a room full of laughter and refused to bow. Richard changed too. The man who once measured success in millions began to measure it in smiles, in opportunities given, in futures rewritten. He often told his colleagues, "That girl reminded me what it means to build something real." They didn't always understand, but he didn't care. For once in his life, he was proud of something beyond his wealth. Years later, when people spoke of Amara, they didn't just call her the girl who spoke 9 languages. They called her a leader, a teacher, a force who turned laughter into respect and dreams into reality. And when they spoke of Richard, they didn't just call him a millionaire. They spoke of the day he stopped laughing and started listening. Amara's legacy spread far beyond the city. Children from different backgrounds, speaking different tongues, began to see themselves not as small, but as powerful. Her story traveled across countries, told in classrooms, written in articles, whispered in homes where parents urged their children never to give up. She became a symbol, not of perfection, but of perseverance. And whenever she stood before a new group of children, she always began the same way. She smiled, lifted her chin, and said, "I speak 9 languages." Then she would pause, waiting for the laughter. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. But always she followed with the words that mattered most. And so can you. In the end, the boardroom laughter was not her defeat. It was her beginning. What started as mockery became a story of triumph, a reminder that the world cannot silence those who refuse to give up. And though Richard Hamilton had once laughed the loudest, he became the one who told her story most proudly. Because he knew, better than anyone, that he had witnessed history the day a girl with a backpack walked into his tower and left behind a legacy no amount of money could ever buy.